If you track the data on planned organizational changes across global industries, you hit a startling empirical reality. Between 60 and 70% of all strategic transformation efforts fail to achieve their objectives. The sheer scale of this strategic waste points to a persistent flaw in how executives approach leadership. We operate under the assumption that a clearly articulated vision and a strong executive mandate are enough to alter the behavior of an entire workforce. This schematic illustrates that exact assumption, a direct line from strategic leadership to successful change. But in reality, strategy does not directly cause human behavior to change. When placed inside a complex, multifaceted system, that direct line shatters under the friction of everyday operations. Executive intent cannot simply be broadcast. It has to be transmitted. It requires an internal machinery, a transmission engine, to translate a high-level directive into a daily routine. Treating leadership as a direct lever ignores the structural realities of the organization. If a CEO pulls that lever without a transmission engine in place, the mandate fails to reach the ground floor. To understand how a strategic directive actually travels down a corporate hierarchy, researchers rely on a statistical technique called structural equation modeling. Looking at our broken diagram, this statistical method allows us to identify mediating variables. These are the active structural nodes that sit exactly between the independent variable of leadership and the dependent outcome of change. We can map out these specific nodes using recent empirical data from a comprehensive study by Ferreide and Dawak and Tessema. They analyzed public organizations in central Gondar, Ethiopia, an environment constrained by limited resources and complex bureaucratic challenges. The researchers found that strategic leadership exerts zero direct force on change management. Its effect is strictly mediated by three specific organizational realities. By defining these three realities, we can finally map out classical business frameworks, like Kotter's steps or the AIDCAR model. They aren't competing philosophies. They are highly specific operational tools designed for highly specific nodes in the statistical architecture. Returning to our model, the top pathway illuminates the first mediating variable, organizational culture. Think of culture as the baseline friction of any operational system. It is the existing set of norms, habits, and assumptions that dictate how work actually gets done. If we expand this culture node, we can see the McKinsey 7S model at work. This framework proves that a new strategy will fail unless it is structurally aligned with shared values, systems, and staff behaviors. To manipulate this cultural baseline, organizations often apply Lewin's planned change theory, which loops continuously through three stages: unfreeze, change, and refreeze. The unfreezing phase is an absolute prerequisite. Before any new software or policy is introduced, leaders must deliberately dismantle existing norms to mitigate the natural resistance that forms when routines are threatened. Once the transition occurs, the refreezing phase locks the new behaviors into the organization's cultural permanence, turning a temporary initiative into the new baseline friction. Strategic leaders cannot bypass this step. Actively engineering and unfreezing the culture is the mandatory first stage for any systemic behavioral shift. Activating the middle pathway reveals the second critical transmission mechanism, knowledge management. This node controls the creation, sharing, and operationalization of new data. While culture dictates collective behavior, the operational reality of executing a change, learning a new compliance protocol, or mastering a new software suite happens entirely at the individual level. Expanding this second node brings in the AIDCAR framework. This is a specific diagnostic tool used to track an individual's psychological and operational transition through 5 steps: awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement. Notice the flow of data into the knowledge and ability tiers. A strategic memo might create awareness of a change, but execution requires the literal knowledge of how to do it and the ability to perform it under pressure. In public organizations where maintaining constant service delivery is critical, these knowledge pipelines must be highly contextualized to prevent catastrophic disruptions during a rollout. If an individual employee lacks the structural framework to acquire these new functional abilities, the macro-level transformation completely stalls. The final pathway in our structural model isolates the accountability node. This is the mechanism required to resolve the inherent friction between what executives intend and what employees execute. Economists define this friction through agency theory, which examines the relationship between a principal, the top management, and an agent, the employee. Any organizational change introduces new risks, new performance metrics, and general uncertainty for the agent. Their initial resistance isn't necessarily sabotage, it is a rational, self-protective response. Within this node, accountability acts not as a punitive tool, but as an alignment engine. It is the deliberate alignment of incentives and the transparent monitoring of behavior so that the principal and the agent are pointing toward the same outcome. In environments dealing with resource scarcity or political decay, these transparent mechanisms justify the necessity of the change and build the baseline trust required to move forward. Without aligning incentives through accountability, agents will inherently resist the directives of the principal, severing the final necessary link to a successful implementation. Zooming out to view the fully assembled architecture, the empirical reality becomes visible. Strategic intent only results in successful change when it flows evenly through culture, knowledge, and accountability. With the structural engine built, we can place chronological models, like Kotter's 8-step process, into proper context. Notice how Kotter's steps wrap around the outside. Steps like creating urgency act as an overarching timeline, dictating precisely when a leader activates different mediator nodes. Managing organizational change is not a matter of choosing between Kotter, McKinsey, or ADKAR. It requires understanding exactly where each tool applies within the transmission engine. The empirical data offers a stark warning. In complex environments, ignoring any of these three mediating variables mathematically guarantees the failure of your strategic initiative. Leaders cannot command transformation by sheer force of will. They have to operate as architects, simultaneously engineering accountability mechanisms, building knowledge pipelines, and integrating new cultural norms. This reveals the ultimate paradox of change management. Organizations do not change, people do. But those people operate entirely within the constraints of the systems constructed around them. Strategic leadership is the art of designing structural systems so effectively that individual behavioral change ceases to be a struggle, becoming an inevitable outcome.